Hi everyone. As you know by this point, we are at part 2 of 4 in Health and the People. Part 2 is called The Beginnings of Change, and in last week's lessons you will have seen how Paré, Vesalius and Harvey, key individuals, made some important steps in what we call the early modern period, the 17th and 18th centuries, or the 16 and 1700s. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk to you about what medicine was like at this point. What ideas were old, which ideas were new, and what might help and what might not. Now, you can make your notes however you want, but if I was doing this, what I would do is draw a table on a piece of paper with an old column and a new column for ideas. And then with two colours, or going back later with a highlighter, separate the ideas that might work and those that might not. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to tell you about the death of Charles II in February 1685. And what I want you to do is when you hear an idea, I want you to pause the video and put it in the old or new column based on whether or not you think this idea existed before this period of time or not. So, on the 2nd of February 1685, King Charles II collapses. Now, historians have since made an educated guess that Charles II may well have had a kidney disease. Others think that it may have been a brain hemorrhage that Charles had. But he collapses. And one of his doctors, Charles has this team of the finest doctors in the land, and we can see some of them tending to him there, as well as a priest. So Charles has this team of doctors, and one of them says the king has collapsed with a disturbance in his brain. Charles has a team of doctors, and they immediately swing into action. They are the best doctors in the country, the best that money can buy. Charles is given 58 drugs. So you might want to pause at this point and decide the giving of medication. Do you think this is a new or an old idea? He also had blood purged from his body. He was also given laxatives to purge his body. And his skin was blistered and cauterized. None of those treatments helped. Now, some of those things that I've listed, you may have heard before. Now, one thing I need to say about Charles II is he has a long-suffering wife, Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, and Charles treats her terribly. She's unable to have children, and Charles has a whole host, a huge list of affairs, and very many other children with other women. And in his affairs, he contracts syphilis, a sexually transmitted infection. And one of the treatments for his venereal disease that he is given is mercury. And you may know from looking at, you might have seen mercury in in chemistry perhaps. But mercury is poisonous if ingested. And he was taking mercury as a treatment for that syphilis. Now, this is where doctors believe it gave him kidney failure, which is what eventually led to his death. But at the time, it wasn't known that mercury was poisonous and it could cause those issues for Charles. I'm now going to read the source. And again, if there's any old or new ideas, add them to your notes. So this is from Sir Charles Scarborough, and he's writing about the treatments that they gave to the king. We opened a vein in his right arm and drew off 425 millilitres of blood. Then another 212 millilitres. To free his stomach of all impurities, we gave him an emetic. Now, an emetic is something that makes you sick. And then a purgative, which is a term at the time for a laxative. So he was given medication to deliberately make him sick or to go to the toilet. And they did that, in the words of Scarborough, to drain away the humours. To accelerate the purgative, we gave him an enema. And an enema is when the king would have had liquids inserted into his bottom to encourage him to go to the toilet. So the doctors were convinced that basically if Charles went to the toilet enough, it could cure him of his illness. We applied blistering agents to his shaved head. His hair was cut short. What you can see there, you can see someone with quite long hair. Actually, that style is known as a periwig. Charles underneath that had quite short hair. But his head was shaved and then he was deliberately blistered. Now, all of that treatment was given to the king on the day of which he collapsed. On the next day, they weren't finished with him. They gave him another purgative and drew off another 300 millilitres of blood from his veins. After 3 days of treatment, Sir Thomas Culpeper says, His Majesty's strength seemed exhausted. He was seized by a mortal distress in breathing and died. So after 3 days, or four, maybe even 4 days of these treatments, the king eventually dies. And the longer the treatment goes on, the more the doctors panic, the more the doctors try, the more it doesn't work. Now, it's great if you're the king and you can afford this, huge team of doctors to help treat you. But what about if you were an ordinary person living in England at the time? Now, it very much depended on what you could afford. And what you could afford depended on the medical advice that you could get. Now, there were 4 places that you could go. First of all, something that we've seen before, the barber surgeon. Now, attending the barber surgeon would often be visiting someone who was poorly trained, and any training they did have was on the job. And they might give a haircut, maybe even shape and shave somebody's facial hair. Beards become very popular in the Stuart period, so they might sort of get a little beard trim and perhaps perform a small operation. It might be to lance a boil, bloodletting, if someone's had a fever recently, pulling teeth out if they've been infected. So they'll perform quite minor operations alongside giving you your short back and sides. Secondly, apothecaries. Now, an apothecary is almost like an early version of a pharmacy. And again, these were people who were set up businesses. They weren't necessarily medically trained, and they often sold medicines and potions to members of the public. Now, the middle class would often use these because sometimes they could be quite expensive. Now, some of the treatments given by the apothecaries had no medicinal impact. Some may have, and others had almost like a hallucinogenic effect, and that led certain customers to believe that it was working. The third thing you could do, particularly in a rural community in villages, you could visit your local wise woman. Now, it's dangerous to be a wise woman because in the century before the time that we're looking at, a woman, particularly a woman who dabbled with making medicines, could quite easily be accused of being a witch. However, by this point, wise women were used in communities and their reputation was often local. And what they would usually have is a good knowledge of plants and herbs and what may or may not help. But their treatments often relied on superstition. So you would take your medicine or potion or whatever you're given at certain times of the day or the year or the month in the hope that it will work. And the final thing, and I've got my little rubber ducky there, is a quack salesman. Quack, Quack, as in the noise a duck makes. A quack was a salesman who travelled from town to town with a cure-all theory that's going to make everybody better. Now, these were often conmen, because they would travel. The villagers wouldn't see them again, or it would be a long time before they saw them. And they sold all of these potions, which they often knew didn't have a medicinal impact. So the quality of healthcare that ordinary people got was very different and of a much poorer quality than the king got. One other thing people still did is they went to the king if they had a condition. And that condition may be scrofula. Now, scrofula was known as the king's evil, and it was believed that the king touching you could cure you from scrofula. And an average 3,000 people a year travelled to London in the hope of receiving the king's touch. Now, you might be thinking, particularly with the wise women and the apothecaries, if they're using these potions and medicines, what are they made out of, and how do we know that they're going to have any impact? You're going to find out on the next slide. So on the last slide, you might have been thinking, how on earth is mashing up some herbs and some plants or some tree bark or whatever it is that these people use, how is that going to make people feel better? Well, I'm going to tell you now. Before we do, I'll give you one or two examples of plants that might have medicinal qualities. First of all, honey can kill bacteria. Secondly, the bark of a willow tree contains aspirin, which is today used as a painkiller. Now, obviously, today our painkillers like aspirin are made in laboratories, and they're made to a much purer strength and more effective for treating pain. But these superstitious remedies were passed down from one generation to the next. And over time, over a long period of time, these the ingredients, the recipes for these cures got better. One way in which it does get better is the creation of the printing press. Now, the printing press basically was a way in which a book or an article or a newspaper or a pamphlet could easily be reprinted onto several pieces of paper. And what that does is it leads to an explosion in the amount of books that are bought and sold. And one of those is by English doctor Nicholas Culpeper. And he produces the book The Complete Herbal in 1653. Now, the example you can see on the slide is a modern version. It's been reprinted and other diagrams have been used. And that just goes to show how some people still believe that nature has all the answers when it comes to providing medical care. Now, Culpeper as an individual used plants and astrology in his treatments. So astrology is cropping up again. That's another old idea, because we saw that in the medieval period. He was very critical of bloodletting and purging of the body. So he has moved away from this idea of the four humours. Now, the problem with herbal remedies is that quacks flourished. These travelling salesmen could claim that their cure-all had medicinal purposes because of the impact that herbal remedies were having. Now, in this book, basically what Culpeper does is he outlines what properties certain plants and herbs have and how they can be used. So, for example, he writes about a herb called Lovage, Lovage. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm going to have to do some research into that. And he says that this herb was a herb of the sun under the sign of Taurus, which strengthened the throat and dried up phlegm. So basically, if you've got a cold, a summer cold, particularly at the time of the year of Taurus, and again, I've forgotten what time of the year that is, you must take this herb. You can maybe drink it with a tea, and it will sort your cold right out. So he tries to find the answer to medicinal problems in medicine. What helps people like Culpeper is exploration. Now, the British involvement in the slave trade explodes in the 17th century, and part of the expansion of the empire and bringing countries under British control was that sailors were explorers were coming back with new goods, and this included new medicines. So, from South America, the bark of the cinchona tree contained quinine, which helped treat malaria. Turkey had opium, and opium began to be used as an anaesthetic. Now, opium comes from the poppy plant. John Woodall, who is a military surgeon, begins to use citrus fruits, lemon and lime, to treat scurvy in the 17th century. And actually, scurvy was the result of vitamin C deficiency, and so that does help fight it off. One thing that was used, and it's a plant from the Americas, and it was brought back, is tobacco. Tobacco was brought back from North America to Britain and was told that it could cure all sorts of remedies. Often people would chew tobacco, and that was the common form of having tobacco at the time. It would be chewed and spat out. And it was wrongly said to cure very many conditions, from toothaches and coughs right the way through to the plague. Obviously, tobacco is jam-packed full of carcinogens and added health problems rather than took them away. Some people did smoke tobacco in a pipe at this time as well, and of course that creates problems for the mouth, the throat and the lungs. And Culpeper didn't have very many friends in the world of medicine. In 1659, one of his students was a man by the name of William Rives, and he published his teacher's biography. And he said that this was Culpeper's view of the Royal College of Physicians, which was the group of the most respected doctors in the country. Bloodsuckers, true vampires, who have learned little since Hippocrates. They use bloodletting for illnesses above the waist and purging for those below it. They evacuate and revulse their patients until they faint. And so Culpeper is a very different doctor to the norm at the time. Okay, now is your opportunity to go back and make sure that you finish that table, or whichever way you've decided to make your notes. But what I want you to do is have an idea of the old ideas and the new ideas, because we've got a mixture at the beginnings of change between these medieval ideas of how to treat people and new concepts. And one thing you might have noticed in the video is that treatment is getting better for the wealthy, and the wealthy are able to get more accurate treatments than ordinary people. Didn't always mean that doctors knew precisely how to treat illnesses, because we saw the case with Charles II. But what I want you to do now is I want you to go back and listen again if you need to, but look at those notes, add to those notes. I want you to tell me what's old and what is new, what works and what doesn't.